It says, this is from, again, Ahmadu Bello's book. It says, we were very conscious indeed that the northern region was far behind the others educationally. We knew that individually the educated northerners could hold their own against the educated southerners, but we simply had not got the numbers they had, nor had we people with the university degrees necessary as a qualification at that time for some of the higher posts. So in other words, what they're saying basically is that there was a time they knew they were handicapped as far as educated professionals were concerned, but as soon as they began to have people, they needed to start putting them in certain places. So what does this have to do? What does this have to do with what we're reading? I'm glad you asked. Here's the issue. What they've been able to do, see what they said, in 2 months they got what they couldn't have gotten in 5 years. In terms of if they were going at the pace they were going for 5 years. In fact, let me read the number again. In the last 2 months, they have had 15 northerners appointed to the senior service, compared with 29 over the past 5 years. So they got 15 in 2 months, but they got 29 in 5 years. So the fact that they were not getting educated and they had northernized the civil service meant that they could get as many as 15. I mean, that's nothing in the south, especially in the west, but that would be something to them in the north, because 15 in 2 months, I mean, in 2 weeks, in 2 months, 15 in 2 months is a lot. Now, here's the issue. Once Ironsi comes along and the Igbo permanent secretaries began to advise him, they are going to reverse all the gains that the northerners had made from 64 to 66. So what they're going to do is to centralize the civil service and then get to move people into the north. And if you say it did not, it could not have happened. Let me tell you what happened in 67. August of 1967, the Biafran forces invaded the Midwest. One of the things that happened after that invasion was that Ojukwu moved civil servants from Enugu into Benin. Read the book, Minority Response to Biafran Invasion and Occupation by Uilawa Uswanlele. That's the document. If you can find it, please do. Minority Response to Biafra's Invasion and Occupation and Nigeria's Liberation by Uilawa Uswanlele. They moved, guys, sorry, I have to mute this clown. I don't have time for rubbish. Here's the point. Even at the time, you know what? I wasn't supposed to read this, but because I hate it when people write things like maybe he's lying and things in the comment section. That's why I read all these things. To be honest, I could just go on saying it. But let's look for that document. May not be like say they make something up. Jilabi, give me a second, please. Minority rights and the national question, or the minority rights response, or the Midwest response to Biafran occupation and invasion. Let me read to you what he said about that. Number one, because it's important to be doing this. Yes, you just have these clowns writing rubbish in the comment section. What they were planning to do in the Midwest was terrible. I found it. The Biafran invasion of the Midwest was also regarded as an Igbo affair. As a result, many Igbo were sent to the Midwest by the Biafran government. One instance of this was the appointment of senior Eastern Igbo civil servants into the Midwest public service without due process on the orders from Biafran authorities in Enugu. I just read that document. That's what I quoted earlier. People were moved from Enugu into Benin, into the Midwest, to become Oga during the war. As a matter of fact, if you have the time, you can read the document. It will tell you about how Ojukwu was asking them to pay a certain amount of money to Enugu from all the Midwest corporations. They're supposed to send a particular amount of money to Enugu, and that's why whenever they tell you that Ojukwu was not going to Lagos, was just going through the Midwest to go to Lagos because it was federal capital, is nonsense. Ojukwu invaded and what's the word? What's that word after invasion? There's a word, they occupied. He invaded and occupied the Midwest, appointed an Igbo, but it has to be Igbo, an Igbo governor, about to conquer, and then mandated that a certain amount of money that they make in that region must be repatriated to the eastern region, to Enugu. He then sent public servants from Enugu into the Midwest to become senior civil servants. That was in 67, 1 year after the unification of the civil services. In other words, whatever you think they're trying to do in 66 that Saro Wiwa is talking about is exactly what Ojukwu did in 67. That's the point I'm trying to make. Does this mean that the North is always right? Of course not. But on this matter, they were correct. You're not going to make what is theirs national in the name of unity. By the way, all this thing of let's all share together because that means that we're all Nigeria is a tactic of a thief. Whatever is yours, take it like that. Let your ambition be curtailed with wisdom. In other words, be ambitious enough to build your place into a paradise, not ambitious to go to other people's places and take over what they have and tell them that we not all want Nigeria. Are you saying that they don't have people that can do those things? Must be you. Because you are nomadic in your mindset, and I'm speaking specifically to Justin and his folks. You guys don't think. And that's the crazy part. You sound exactly like your elders. Which means you're going to make the exact same mistakes they made, and you're going to have the same repercussions. So that means there is no growth. But continue. God be with you. Waje foya. You know what that means? Waje sombe ya. Where were we? The Igbo permanent secretaries in... Okay, let me go back just a bit. So he was talking about that there was a vacuum after, the military took over, the politicians left, and the civil servants moved up. Now remember that before this, many of the permanent secretaries were already Ibos. And I recommended a document the other day. If you check our Telegram channel, Redomi Global, it's free. You don't have to pay anything to join. Redomi Global. If you go to the learning section, learning resources section, you will find a document called White Paper on Political Alignment of Western Region. White Paper on Political Alignment in Western Nigeria. Please look at that. Find that paper. It's right there. It's free. You can download it. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Before these military guys took over, they were already dominating the civil service, and they did not do it because they had merit. They did it because of they did it using nepotism. They filled the entire place with their own people. Never mind whether they were qualified or not qualified. Qualification is secondary. The real thing is ethnicity. That was what got you there. E.g., there was a man who got a job, was Njoku, who got a job after retiring. It was a messenger. He retired. They brought him back. Guess what they made him? They made him the head of a recruitment staffing recruitment committee. Messenger will now recruit the engineers and the chief executive officers or whatever of that organization, of the NRC, Nigeria Railway Corporation. Is in that document. In fact, there's another document, the one that one is from the Commission of Inquiry, where one of those Igbo guys asked the Yoruba engineer, what you go give us smoke with chop or something like that. That one now saying he cannot eat. Ridiculous questions that have nothing to do with engineering. There's a Commission of Inquiry that was set up into how these people were recruited. And it is damning. The report is damning, right? But maybe if we have the time, we'll check it out some other time. But if you want to know what the civil service was like, download that document in the Telegram channel, White Paper on Political Alignment in Western Region. It was published by NCNC, the Western Caucus, and what they saw were in the hands of our wonderful brethren. So after the politicians had run away, of course, ran away because they had killed most of them, but many of them, and there was no need for them to even be in Lagos anyway. The vacuum created by the absence of politicians from the scene was conveniently filled by career civil servants who suddenly found themselves in power at the center and in the regions. In place of an army of ministers, there was now a single military governor who was quite unused to public life and who in any case could not take direct responsibility for running the over 10 ministries in his region. The permanent secretaries of the various ministries therefore found themselves as both makers and executors of policy. Many appeared intoxicated by the newfound power, none more so than a handful of Igbo federal permanent secretaries, who now found a fellow Igbo in a position that carried unchallengeable power and prestige, and as head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces. As Ironsi himself proved pliable, the permanent secretaries moved in on him in one fell swoop. They led Ironsi to the slaughter. The occasion was the creation of what amounted to a unitary system of government in place of the federal system that had been in operation since the late 40s. The Igbo permanent secretaries in question had calculated, it was said, that under a unified system, listen to this, there would be free mobility of skill and labor, and that therefore several Southerners or Ibos, that's what they wrote there, or Ibos, who had been itching for jobs, which the North traditionally reserved for Northerners or for expatriates, those people will now go to the North to work. Why? I will not want Nigeria. This ill-advised decision was duly placed before the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. They underestimated what reaction this would elicit from the North itself, where the inhabitants had been smarting under grunts from some Igbo resident there since the death of Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto. In other words, since January. Folks in the North have had to endure the taunting of Igbo residents in the North, in Kaduna, in Kano, insulting them. We played the song there the other day. It's not very nice. You know, Machine Gun by Celestine Oku, Ewu Nabakwa by Rex Lawson, just blaring it in the public parks, you know, taunting the people. That was already on the ground though. That they never do anything about that one. You can't go say you go unify everything. Now change your spark. I suppose the Sardauna was something of an where was I? They underestimated the reaction that this would elicit from the North itself, where the inhabitants had been smarting under grunts from some Igbo residents there since the death of Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto. I suppose the Sardauna was something of an ogre down south. His unyielding pride, some of his undiplomatic statements, and his rigorous defense of the interests of the North had not endeared him to many of his countrymen down south. Not so his fellow followers in the North, to whom it was a formidable bulwark against Southern Red Igbo domination. To decree a unitary system of government so soon after the death of the Sardauna looked as if they were being regarded as a conquered people. Their feeling of insecurity, which had led to such policies as Northernization, which we read about earlier, and the imposition of certain ill-qualified personnel of the federal public service, heightened. Where were those ill-qualified people from? From Igbo land. Again, I should say this: if you are Igbo, sincerely, from my heart, it's not an attack on you. I'm not saying you're a bad person, but your so-called leaders did the worst in Nigeria's history. As far as, I mean, just terrible. Nobody only passed so, but man, was terrible. In May of 1966, they took out their anger on Ibos residents in the North in a cruel and unwarranted, I don't know if it's unwarranted, because they took a lot. They took a lot from January to May. They were seething. Kimieti Wambe own simmer was simmering. Just waiting, it's like gunpowder. Any spark by Ogbano Jenny. So he says, but this is what he wrote. He says in May of 1966, they took out the anger on Ibos residents in the North in a cruel, and it was cruel, unwarranted whirlwind of loot and destruction, which spread through the length and breadth of that region. This did not look like a spontaneous affair. It was definitely carefully calculated and was dastardly. Basically, Ironsi's decision was wrong in the extreme. His declared reason was that since the army's approach to administration was monolithic, the same system ought to be applied in the administration of the country. If that were so, because you're writing nonsense in the comment section. The point is this: and by the way, I did a video a while back. Please check it out on YouTube. It's called How Ojukwu Rejected Aburi. Because even though what he wanted was preposterous, he still got it. There was a decree that was passed in March of 1967, decree number 8, that Yakubu Gowon promulgated in March of 67. That was a decree that would have given Ojukwu what he wanted, but he said no. We have another conversation about that, but if you really want to know about it, please check out the video on YouTube channel. Search Busui Ores, How Ojukwu Rejected Aburi. especially if you're Igbo, a lot of the things that they've told you, now lie, Fulam, now lie. Some of the books I referred to in that book, in that video, a number of them are actually books written by Eastern authors. N.U. Akpan, as the secretary to the government of the Eastern region, N.U. Akpan, and also Ilari Njoku, who was the commander of the Biafran army. Those two wrote about what happened with decree number 8 in March of 67 and Ojuku's reaction to that decree. Please watch that video. Anyway, let's get back to this. I was saying that if Ironsi wants to make the argument, which is fair, I mean, you can make the argument that whatever is good for the goose is also good for the gander. Gowon could make the argument as well. Why? He's a military. The military has not changed. Has the military tradition changed in 2 days? Ironsi was in power up until July 29, 1967. Gowon became head of state August 1. Between July 29 and August 1, what has changed in military traditions that would allow Gowon to decentralize power and ensure that it was not having all the power like a dictator should? And the crazy part, the real crazy part is that he still passed that, he still came up with a decree that essentially weakened him, which is what Ironsi would never have done, which is what Ojuku would never have done. How do I know? Because May of 66, Ojuku was the one who was trying to get his attorney general in this region to write a decree, the same decree, what's called Unitary decree that became decree number 34. How do I know that? Because the man, the attorney general, wrote a book. The book is called Ojuku's Rebellion and World Opinion, and the man's name is Nebo Graham Douglas. Ojuku was saying man should write a unitary constitution in May of 66. Is it that Ojuku that will now decentralize power if he was the one who was heading? Meanwhile, as at June of 66, he was already telling how he wanted to become the head of the country. June 7, 1966. Read that book. By the way, that book is also free on Redmi Global. Those are the only few. Okay, there's some free stuff there because it's difficult to come by some of those materials. But read those things, especially if I'm from the Southeast. Please read those things. Please don't they don't lie to you too much. I beg. We'll continue. I beg. Where were we? Basically, Ironsi's decision. I'm reading the book On a Darkling Plain by Saro Wiwa. Basically, Ironsi's decision was wrong in the extreme. His declared reason was that since the army's approach to administration was monolithic, the same system ought to be applied in the administration of the country. But there was nothing to support that assumption. The federal nature of the country had not in any way impeded military rule. Besides, Ironsi himself had set up a constitutional committee, and to act as he did was to prejudice its report. Ironsi set up a constitutional committee. Then there was another committee of one man, his name Francis Nwokedi. Where that man came from, you can tell yourself. You can tell. That person now came up with a single man, like a minority report, that we need unitary system in Nigeria, and they adopted it. Why? Because the permanent secretaries in the civil service who were Ibos and the civilians in NCNC. Read the book by Adewale Ademoyiga. That's exactly what he said. He said what Ironsi did was to implement NCNC policies. One of the major policies that NCNC had way back in 1951 was unitary system. That was long before independence. Zika started with his book in 1943, talking about why we should have a federal system. By the end of the 1940s, he had changed his mind. By 51, they were pushing hard to have a unitary system in Nigeria. Right? The book in 43 is called The Political Blueprint for Nigeria. It was a pamphlet that Zik published in 1943. By 1949-50, they were changing everything. By 51, they were pushing hard for unitary system. They didn't get it for 15 years. As soon as Ironsi got there, one man's report changed everything. Even though there was a committee sitting, nobody cared about what the committee was saying. Until this early. Says there was nothing to support that assumption. The federal nature of the country had not in any way impeded military rule. Besides, Ironsi himself had set up a constitutional committee, and to act as he did was to prejudice its report. Federalism had been a subject of national debate for a long time, and if anything at all, the trend was towards broadening the base of federalism, certainly not towards a unitary system. The uprising in the north was a sign of things to come. It should be noted, though, that Yakubu Gowon did the same thing through the back door. As will be seen later, his action in seizing the oil resources of minority peoples added to his total control of the military governors in the various states, effectively diluted the federal base of the country and imposed something like a unitary system, while succeeding military administrations have reinforced, which the succeeding military administrations have reinforced. Apparently, Gowon could do it, but Ironsi was not allowed to do it. That's the point. You see, Ironsi did it. You can't blame Gowon for doing the same. But guess what? Let's even say we want to blame Gowon. Why I cannot blame Gowon personally was because he did something that I don't think any military, I don't know if anybody has done it before. Please let me know. You know, everybody, there's a lot to learn. I don't know of any military ruler who would decentralize and grant the regions or states autonomy and make himself less powerful, instead invest that power in the Supreme Military Council, not in himself. And in that Supreme Military Council, the governors of the region can decide what will happen. If they are against whatever he wants to do, he cannot do it. This is what was in the decree number 8 though. I don't know of any military dictator or head of states that would do that. I don't. If you know, please let me know. That was what he did in March. Ojukwu rejected it. If you read, I mentioned the author earlier, but I didn't mention the name of the books. N.U. Akpan wrote a book called The Struggle for Secession. In that book, he was the secretary of the government of the Eastern region. He was with Ojukwu in Aburi, January 4 and 5, 1967. He wrote a book, The Struggle for Secession. You know what he said? He said decree number 8 gave Ojukwu 95% of what he asked for in Aburi. 95. If you read The Tragedy Without Heroes, was written by Hilary M. Njoku. Hilary Njoku was the head of Biafra military, the very first one, before Madiabo came along later. Njoku was the head of the Biafra military. Njoku said in his book that when he went to Ojukwu's office, his private secretary, his first name is Don, that man was a lawyer. That man told him, Njoku, that decree number 8 was 98% of what they asked for in Aburi, and that the other 2% is just military jargons that you cannot understand, but that the real thing, that everything they want is that's 98%, but that the other 2% is just military jargon that's unnecessary. I don't want to open because of time, but I really read it. I read those 2 documents. If you watch that video, how Ojukwu rejected Aburi. The point I'm trying to make is that if N.U. Akpan is saying you got 95%, and Hilary Njoku is saying you have Don Egbe, that's his name. The private secretary's name is Don Egbe, right? He was a lawyer, and he's saying that they had 98% of what they asked for in Aburi, and you still say no. If I were Yakubu Gowon, I would do exactly what Yakubu Gowon did. Say you don't want decentralization, Abi, until you break everything apart. That's what you want. Oh yeah, create new states. Time. But I really read it. I read those 2 documents. If you watch that video, how Ojukwu rejected Aburi. The point I'm trying to make is that if N.U. Akpan is saying you got 95%, and Hilary Njoku is saying you have Don Egbe, that's his name. The private secretary's name is Don Egbe, right? He was a lawyer, and he's saying that they had 98% of what they asked for in Aburi, and you still say no. If I were Yakubu Gowon, I would do exactly what Yakubu Gowon did. Say you don't want decentralization, Abi, until you break everything apart. That's what you want. Oh yeah, create new states. May 27, 1967. Create new states. Break that Eastern region into 3. The Western region was already broken into 2, Abi. Break the remaining one. Break into 2 again. So we have 6 in the south. Then break the north into 6. Everything is now 12. Come and do your worst. And what's the worst that he did? May 30, he declared Biafra. And then eventually, that's how if you look at the trajectory, nobody should have died in the eastern region. If you are from the east and you think about all the people that died and the hunger, the only person, in fact, you can blame everybody, but the only person responsible for the carnage was Ojukwu. But no, is a guru. You will extol the one who is wrong and demonize the one who is helping or who helped you, because we all have to bear it together. I don't bear nonsense. All of this to say that, especially if you're from the south and you're listening to this, it's not an attack on your region. It's an expose on what leaders from your space did. And if you take it as an attack on your region, what you're doing is that you're trying to tell us to shut up because it makes you feel uncomfortable. But nobody cares about your feeling. Not because they don't matter, but because they don't really count. I don't know what difference that is. In other words, they matter to you, they don't count to us. The best we can do is to share these things respectfully. But we can't just hide and sweep everything under the carpet and allow you, right, the children of those who wronged us, to insult us and our fathers who were wronged. That's not going to happen. May God bless you. Where were we? So they were talking about the fact that he changed everything, and I'll read a few more things before we go back to that, but I hope we can get to the book before we go tonight. Ironsi, again, the book is called On a Darkling Plain. This particular one is by Saro Wiwa. And by the way, I think this man, sincerely, he was very gracious to Ibos. Very. I think it was even too much. Himself and this other author, Elechi Amadi, the Ikwere man, they were very gracious. They're very gracious. But some people say insult them, but I mean, it's okay. Let's keep reading. Ironsi, in his perpetual dilemma of trying to please everybody, appeared to be at a loss what to do. The Ibos were predictably and rightly too angry at the May riots. They were even more furious at Ironsi's failure to take decisive action against the rioters. They began to contemplate a return to their homeland, but they were advised against this, seeing that the balance of power in the Federation still rested with them. As Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and Head of State, the military governorship of the East, the Solicitor General of the Federation, and a host of powerful permanent secretaries and diplomatic representatives abroad, having filled up those spaces using nepotism. I had to say that. Eventually, Ironsi was pleased to appoint a commission of inquiry into the May riots. This soothed the Ibos somewhat. The sign of coming squalls had by this time become quite predictable. It was visible in most national institutions. It was at about this same period that Ironsi made a number of promotions in the army. It was said that about 80% of those promoted were Ibos. Calculators. I need a calculator. Let's confirm. Where's my calculator? 18 divided by 21 times 100 is 85.71%. It's 85.71%. This is not 80%. It's 85.71. They were going to promote 18 Igbo officers. Then someone told them that I was so Igbo. So now put 3. And by the way, if you read the book that they're always shouting about, you find it there. And the one at Demega's book, Why We Struck. 18 Igbo officers, 3 Northerners promoted above their Ogas, the 5 Yoruba. So you had 21. So that's 85.7%. It's more than 80%. I knew it. My mouth was mathing. Let's continue. They were grown. Okay, so it says it was about the same period that Ironsi made a number of promotions in the army. It was said that about 80% of those, okay, it said about, so it's right. It didn't say exactly, so it's correct. About 80% of those promoted were Ibos. Again, there were grumblings, particularly from the north. The point was made that those promoted merited it, and that in fact they had been discriminated against in the past. No one wants to hear that sort of thing in Nigeria. especially if the beneficiaries of any act happen to be of the same ethnic origin as the benefactor. By the way, some of the people that also committed the planned and executed the coup were also promoted while in detention, collecting salaries and watching TV. These promotions shook the army to its very foundation. Ironsi had to make a hurried tour to the north to address troops there.